welcome back at the paper of the week. Today, it's my great pleasure to talk to Daniel Truhn, MD, MSc, physicist, and radiologist who has published a tremendously interesting work in radiology recently. His work is entitled Using AI Machine Learning to Reduce the Need for Contrast Agent in Breast MRI through Synthetic Images. And today, we have more time to talk to Daniel about the background of the work, the clinical implication, and plus, and this is why this talk going to be very interesting, the technical background, because again, Daniel combines radiologic expertise with the knowledge of a physicist. So thanks again, Daniel, for joining us today, and let's start.
All right, thank you very much, Matthias. Yes, as you stressed already, and as we have teasered in a nutshell, we examined if we can get rid of contrast agent in breast MRI imaging. And I can already tell you, at least in our examination, I think we can't at the moment. So that was the first experiment actually that we did. We examined if we can, just based on the non-contrast agent images, so on the T1 axial image of the breast and the T2 weighted axial image of the breast, can reconstruct the post-contrast image, the first post-contrast image. And we try to train an AI model on that, a generative adversarial network, the so-called GAN, which is one of the states of the art in synthesizing such images. And then we tested that. So we trained it on about 10,000 breast MR examinations. And then we tested that on a test set that we put apart beforehand. So that test set had not been seen by the network before. And we tested if we just put in the T1 weighted and T2 weighted images without any contrast agent administration, can the network actually generate the post-contrast image? And we found that in principle, it seems to work. And there have been quite a lot of examination investigations which claim this works very well. But when you look deeper, when you actually look at a lot of lesions, you find that there are some problems associated with this. Sometimes you are led to believe, if you can see the image on the T1 and T2 weighted images already, so if it's a mass lesion, you're led to believe it works, because in those cases, usually it works. The information is there in the T1 and T2 weighted images. However, if that information is not there in those images, if it's a non-mass lesion and it's already hard to see for the radiologist if there's a lesion without any contrast agent, we found the AI model doesn't really help much in this regard. I can show you some images that might illustrate. The first three images on the left side are the actual examination, so as acquired by the scanner. Then what we see when we try to generate the post-contrast images, that it works really well for this approach that I have just described. So where we just put in those two non-contrast images. So only those two are given to the network, the AI model, and the AI model then generates this image. It looks as if it works really well, right? Because this is the real image, not seen by the AI model. And this is the image that is reconstructed by the AI model just based on the non-contrast images. So you are led to believe it works well. But then when you look a bit deeper, then you see that for lesions where you cannot really distinguish the lesion, when it's not a mass lesion, on the non-contrast images, the post-contrast image is actually different from the real post-contrast image. So the generated post-contrast image seen on the right here is missing the lesion. This is, of course, a problem, as you can imagine. So you might miss lesions if they are not visible on the non-contrast enhanced images. Even worse, or similarly bad, you can sometimes find regions where the AI model thinks there is some contrast enhancement. So we see this in the line patient C. The AI model, again, only got these two images, only the non-contrast images. And it actually generates some contrast agent accumulation where there is no contrast image accumulation. And within the same examination, it also misses one lesion again. So we found this approach does not work well. So the second thing that we then examined was, can we, if we cannot renounce completely on contrast agent, can we maybe use a reduced contrast agent dose? So spare the patient some of the contrast agent. Although contrast nowadays is very safe, the macrocyclic contrast agents that we administer during the examination do not have any adverse effects, almost none. Sometimes it might be beneficial to reduce the contrast agent dose to give to the patient. For one, it might save a bit of money, of course, but that's not a big chunk of the MRI examination. But as a second reason, you might even get benefits from that, because as you might know, high concentrations of contrast agents have adverse effects, non-expected effects on the signal intensity. You sometimes see this when you scan a patient and the patient has already excreted the contrast agent through the kidneys, and you look at the bladder, and you see in a region with considerably high contrast agent concentration, you see a high signal as expected. But when you go to the regions of the bladder where there's even higher contrast agent concentration in the lower regions due to the gravity, the contrast agent concentration in the lower parts of the bladder is even higher, then you see the high signal intensity is even deleted. So it has an adverse effect due to T2 shortening. And that might be a problem as well. So you could imagine, and that needs to be investigated in the future, that with a lower contrast agent administration, you might be able to get more information from the lesions because you do not have the saturation effect with lower contrast agent administrations. So we examined this. The problem of this, of course, is you have a rather low signal to noise ratio. So if you only apply a low contrast agent in the subtraction images, which are shown here, the signal to noise ratio is not sufficient to be diagnostic. So what we did is we trained the network that we used in the first experiment as well to get as an input the non-contrast images, because we wanted to retain this information, but also the reduced contrast image. So this one, which is only acquired after giving the patient 25% of the contrast agent dose. And to see if then the AI model, so we trained a second AI model on the same data set, if then the AI model can reconstruct the full information. And what we found then is that this works quite well. So this you can see in this row here. So you see the lesion that we looked at as the first lesion before is equally well reconstructed as in the case where we just put in the non-contrast images. However, it also accurately reconstructs the images where it's rather difficult, just based on the non-contrast images, to find the lesion. So compare the real post-contrast image to the synthesized post-contrast image, and you'll find that both the lesion is accurately depicted here, and also there's no false contrast displayed in a lesion or in a region where you do not have any false contrast agent. So this is very important, and that prompted us then to test these cases in a more rigorous and setup with two experienced radiologists. And we asked the two experienced radiologists, with these two setups, can you please rate if the lesion, as compared to the full contrast agent dose, is equally visible as in the synthesized post-contrast image that we got from our AI model. And we did this for two experienced radiologists and asked them to score it in a Likert scale score from 1 to 5, where 5 is the best score. And we found that both radiologists agreed that in almost all cases where we used the model in which we input the low contrast image as well, there's a high correlation and a really good depiction of contrast enhancing lesions. However, when we only use the non-contrast images, we find that the scores are pretty much lower. So they are not usable in the diagnostic setting. It needs to be stressed here, however, so there have been a lot of publications beforehand that showed that you can completely renounce on contrast agent. They also sometimes include diffusion-weighted images, so they include additional information. However, you should also be aware that it needs to be really closely investigated, not only for bigger lesions or not only for lesions, mass lesions, which are visible in the non-contrast images, but also for very tiny non-mass lesions, for example. And I would like to see much more of these examinations in the future, where you critically look at, does this method of just using the non-contrast images really work when you imaging lesions. That's a very important takeaway that we took away from our study as well, that we found at first sight, as I've shown you in this figure, at first it looks like it works, but then when you dive deeper, it shows some artifacts, some really bad artifacts, actually, some lesions where there are non-lesions, some non-lesions where there are lesions, that make it unusable, at least in our setup, to be used in clinical routine. That is the paper in a more bigger nutshell, so to speak. And I'm sure, Matthias, you have some questions or some remarks. Sorry for speaking too long, maybe.
Substitution is one thing and compensation is the other one. So basically, if I, in my simple-minded radiology sort of perspective, you can compensate a loss of a little bit of contrast agent using sophisticated post-processing, and that's AI. And this is kind of intuitive, isn't it, right? It's like I'm using not great camera, but I'm using a filter or a post-processing tool, and I will get beautiful pictures, which I can post on Insta, which look like high-end professional pictures. I mean, that's basically the narrative behind, right? But you still need a camera, don't you? Without a camera, there's no picture. And that's a different sort of story we are currently discussing in the scientific environment. Can we completely get rid of contrast agent? And here, thank you very much for explaining that and showing you this convincing examples that at least at a time being, it's not possible just to skip it. For me, as a breast MR native, if you wish, it's kind of intuitive, right? Because you need information. You have, I mean, AI can augment reality. We're talking about augmented reality, but this always needs some sort of baseline signal. You cannot augment zero, right? And here you come in also as a radiologist and a clinician. I mean, palpable lesion, right? Which are visible on T2, mass lesions, as you showed. It's not that super surprising that you can predict them and do some kind of color sort of stuff. But the real tough lesion, which are basically the reason why we're doing breast MR, we do, right? Palpable lesion, which are seen on ultrasound and mammography, we don't need breast MR. These are the real troublemakers and challengers. And here, thanks for sharing these beautiful images from your database, from your study, where it's clear, at least at the time being, in the setting of this study, it's not possible to skip it. It would be even unsafe and maybe even dangerous at the time being and with this technology. So after summarizing that, let's look in the future. And what do you think, again, as a physicist and as a radiologist, how far can we go? How far can you reduce the contrast agent? And do you eventually even see the possibility, well, still to skip it in some sort of cases? Or do you think, okay, this is something which never gonna happen, and this is basically the way as far as we go, and that's basically the end of story, and now it has to get into clinical application?
That AI is not magic. AI does not put in information which is not there. AI is very good to extract information and then to reconstruct it on very large databases. But if the information is not there in the input, so in the non-contrast images, there's no way that any AI model whatsoever in the future will just generate it for you. And I also would like to stress, because I see this over and over again in any project related to AI and radiological images, that humans are already pretty good at pattern recognition. So if you do not see it as a human, if you don't see any information whatsoever as a human in the non-contrast images, I think it's very, very hard to believe that the AI will see something. Of course, it might always be the case that we miss something because we haven't seen millions of images, and that once the AI has seen millions of images, it can extract information that is actually there. But I have my doubts, because contrast agent accumulation is actually measuring something that you do not see in the non-contrast images. It's measuring how, if and to what extent blood is circulating in those tumors, and what the permeability of maybe even some more microscopic molecular mechanisms that you probably do not see in the non-contrast images because the resolution is not high enough, because now speaking about T1 and T2 contrast is not suitable to extract this information. So I would say we probably will not be able to renounce on contrast agent completely. There'll probably always be the need to administer some contrast agent in order to extract this information. A possible replacement could be diffusion-weighted images, because some of the information that I just mentioned, like how well is that lesion permeated by blood, can also be extracted to a certain extent by diffusion-weighted images, where you can measure how much blood is really flowing there, how fast is the flow rate, like IVIM, intravoxel incoherent motion. However, the problem with this is the resolution is rather limited. It's not as high the resolution as you can achieve with contrast agent and conventional T1 weighted images. So in some of the publications that have been published beforehand, we see that authors use diffusion-weighted images to replace kind of this information that you get from contrast agent. And it seems to work for rather big lesions. But when you go to smaller lesions, I have the feeling, and if you go to really small lesions, that at least at the current point in time and in the foreseeable future, the resolution will not be enough to be equivalent and to deliver equivalent information as to the information that you get with contrast agents. So to sum it up, I'm skeptical that we can renounce on contrast agent completely, and we will probably be using it for a long time still to come. That's my assessment.
Thanks, Daniel. And I think that we have to be fair and objective to get the technology forward. And adding something to the diffusion discussion is kind of also similar, basically, to the AI story. I mean, where AI has problems, also diffusion has problems, right? So we are not talking about a palpable lesion, as you showed in figure on the leg. This is like an ACRR breast or ACRB breast, and there's a kind of typical nodule, 1.5 centimeter. This is not where we need actually breast MR sometimes, right? The lesions where we are here are the small lesions and the small cancers, non-mass, and this is exactly where diffusion also is having trouble for reasons which are evident and I mean are difficult to solve in the future. So I personally follow your assessment that this will be tough, but I like tough. It means also a challenge. Plus, a second issue which might also discuss. I mean, the more data you have, the higher the dimensionality is, right? The more data you need to have the same level. So, like if you're training on a very simple data, you might use definitely less data than you will add another parameter. So AI is super data hungry, isn't it? So here you have like 10,000 patients, which is also quite a bit if you talk about breast MR. But if you add diffusion, and you want to have a network which is as stable as this one, you would probably need factor 10.
You're completely right. The trend is the more complex the model or the input is that you feed into the model, the more reasons the model might have to overfit and to exclude this overfitting during the training. That means just looking at the training data and kind of learning the training data by heart. You need to have a large database. And I assume so you would probably need a lot more than 10,000 images. Plus, very important detail here as well. We have been training on mono-institutional data. So that was just from one institution. And usually MR images in particular can be quite different depending on what scanner you use, depending on what protocol you use, even depending on how you position the patient in the scanner and how you fixate the breast. So if you want to account for this as well, to have an algorithm which works well on any kind of examination, you need a lot more data, actually. We're currently trying an EU project in which we gather different European partners which have a lot of expertise in breast MRI and have large databases. And that will be a challenge that we'll try to tackle, not only for this particular AI model of reducing the need for contrast agent administration, but also for AI models which potentially can recognize breast cancer in breast MRI in an automated way, made to support the radiologist, to augment intelligence of the radiologist, to make her or him maybe a bit more efficient. And you need a lot of data, a lot of multi-institutional data for that. And that is a challenge that is particularly challenging in breast MRI, I would say.
Couldn't agree more. I mean, if you look at the tremendous publication and the effort of the screening research groups using hundreds of thousands of images to get great images, I mean, we would need a multitude, like more than that, to have the same robustness for breast MR. And it's not like, okay, let's add diffusion and then we will fix the problem. I mean, then you need another factor 10, 20, you cannot say it, but as a significantly bigger amount of data. And one question I wanted to ask you, we are talking here about basically on initial enhancement, right? Which we are simulating. So this is more about initial phase, but we know in breast MR, there's also quite a chunk information in the curves, right? Mm-hmm. Currently, it's still birated, so it's a must. And according to my experience during the last 20 years, it's an essential information. Did you also simulate the curve, or was it only about simulating the initial enhancement? And any comment on that?
Actually, initially, it was only about the initial enhancement, because as you said, it's easier for the network if it doesn't have to tackle high dimensionality, because asking the network to then generate even more images makes the problem even harder. And we are currently tackling that, and we are also using a different class of generative models, diffusion models now, which seem to be a bit more powerful. But still, this is something for which you need a lot of data. What we observed in our experiments so far is that this is also challenging, because, as you said, it's another kind of information, right? It's not only predicting the initial enhancement, but then also the time dimension, how fast this enhancement, what direction this enhancement is going actually. And that seems to be a bit harder for the networks as of now, but we are still on it, so to speak.
So as a simple-minded as a radiologist, I mean, this comes not without too much surprise, because I mean, the initial phase is kind of switching on the light, boom, there I am. This is detection and then characterization, as I said, and it's tougher, right, to predict. And it's quite, well, evident, maybe too tough of a word, but it's kind of not too surprising that it's also more of a challenge, because AI is basically doing the same job as we are, like detecting a lesion and detecting the light ball is easy, but then looking about the time curve of the subtle changes of enhancement, the curve, that's more important and more difficult. And this is what takes more expertise. And it's not a great surprise that it's also more important for difficult for AI. Again, this probably can be solved, but this needs more data, right?
More data is better.
And again, a parallel to humans, isn't it, right? The more experience you have, right? Like the 20, 30, 40-year-old radiologist, I mean, he has seen more. He's doing simply better, right? Exactly. Amazing. Thanks for taking your time, Daniel. It was very, very, very interesting. I just sum up from my key point, and you please go ahead and correct me. So your study was about training AI to predict like the early enhancement in a huge and representative data set from one of the leading breast MR institutions worldwide. And your key message is essentially that you need a contrast agent to predict. You just cannot skip it at the time being. So this is very important, but you could use this approach for reducing the amount of contrast agent. And a very important aspect, and that's typical for the Aachen group, clinically environment is important. Okay, so small lesions, the tough lesions, in other words, the lesion where we need breast MR, they need still, even if you use AI, contrast agent. I think this is the beautiful take home, and obviously there's much to study. We mentioned this as well. So what about the curve? What about diffusion, etc.? Let's finally put your work a little bit in the context about the huge amount of papers currently on that topic, because as you said, Many other papers are out there, and some authors claim, okay, we can do it. Others are more critical. So just a quick summary, because this may be also interesting for our followers who are not that much into the literature like you are.
There are quite a number of studies which try to reconstruct contrast agent accumulation from the non-contrast agent part of the examination. So actually the first experiment that we did in our examination. And they claim, or some of these examinations, or some of these publications claim that this works, but it is very essential that you test it on the right and on a very diverse set of lesions. If you only test it on rather simple lesions, as you said, then you would probably find it works. But you need to dive really deep into all kind of lesions. And it's important to look for proof of absence of working of this algorithm, because that's really the hard part. It's like Carl Sagan once said that the absence of proof is not the proof of absence, and that's very true. Proving absence is very hard, and so you need to put a lot of effort into going through a lot of different cases and test it in a lot of different cases. And that is something which I'm skeptical if all of the examinations, all of the publications that I've seen so far that claim that this works have done, that they have really tested it on all kind of lesions. I do not say that this is by malignant design. It might just be that it's on oversight, because they might not have a sufficiently large database in which they have all of these kind of lesions. But it's very important to be skeptical, I think, in general, and in this research field anyways.
Once again, congratulations to this landmark paper published in Radiology recently. I recommend to all guys of you to read this paper, to go into detail, because this is here great application of AI to be used in the future for breast imaging. Daniel, thanks very much for joining us today again. There's always a tradition already that the final sentence, the final message is obviously not by me. It's you. Any final concluding remark to all of followers?
I'm glad to be born in this time because the possibilities that we have now with all of these algorithms model are sheer endless, and we are just at the beginning of what can be done. So good times ahead, I think. That's what I want to say.